Hello, everyone, and welcome to this morning's Washington Huskies live Q&A. I'm Lauren Smith. I cover the Huskies for the News Tribune here in Tacoma, Washington. And with me today is Kyle Hansen, who covers Montana at KPAX-TV in Missoula. Hi, Kyle. And we are here to preview the return of college football to Seattle this weekend. This is an exciting week. After there was just so much uncertainty surrounding college football in the season last year, seasons were shortened, schedules changed. Teams have been able this season to go through their offseason preparation and camps this spring, and now fall training camps to get ready for what's expected to be a full schedule of games over the next few months. This is week one for the Huskies, who host Montana in the season opener for both teams at 5 p.m. Saturday at Husky Stadium. This is the first of three non-conference games to open the season for UW. They'll travel to Ann Arbor next week to play Michigan before returning home the following week when Arkansas State comes to town. And then they end the month by hosting Cal in their Pac-12 opener on September 25th. That's the first of 9 conference games on the schedule this season, which ends in November with the Apple Cup in Seattle. But before all that happens, the Huskies have Montana on deck tomorrow. So just here, a quick history of the meetings between UW and Montana. They've played 19 times in their history. The Huskies have won 17 of those, including the most recent meeting in 2017. Montana has won once, and then they have also tied once. And a brief recap of each team from last year. Washington, coming off a 3-1 record in their shortened 4-game season last fall. They had wins over Oregon State, Arizona, and Utah, and then they lost to Stanford in their final game. They won the Pac-12 North, but ultimately withdrew from the conference championship game and a bowl appearance due to COVID-19. And then the Grizz won both of the games that they played this spring by pretty large margins against Division II opponent Central Washington, and then fellow Big Sky member Portland State back in April. So heading into Saturday, the Huskies have checked in at number 20 in the AP's preseason top 25 poll and 21 in the coaches poll. And then the Grizz enter the season ranked 9th in the preseason FCS rankings. So Kyle and I have a handful of questions for each other today to preview tomorrow's season opener and dive into what fans can expect to see on the field when they return to Husky Stadium tomorrow for the first time since the 2019 Apple Cup. So with that, let's get started. Kyle, thank you for joining me today. Like I mentioned earlier, obviously seasons were shortened or altered across college football last season. But for the 2 games Montana did play this spring, what were kind of the biggest takeaways? And then how similar does this team look to the one that took the field back in April?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Lauren, so much for having me on, and to the rest of the News Tribune team. This is super exciting. I'm telling everybody I'm about halfway done with my drive from Missoula to Seattle, about a 7-hour drive. So nice little road trip to get over here. Weather's beautiful. And, you know, it's really exciting because for the Grizz, like you mentioned, they postponed their fall season to the spring of 2021, but they ultimately opted out of that, as did Montana State and a handful of other Big Sky Conference teams. But the Grizz did make an abridged 2-game spring schedule. And, you know, they looked good. You know, it was, I think the biggest thing that those games did for this team was just to get them on the field and play. Because at that point, it had been about a year and a half. They played in the 2019 FCS playoffs, lost in the quarterfinal round to Weber State. But up in, you know, after that, that'd been about, I think, 17, 18 months until they played a football game. So that was the biggest thing in the spring. And, you know, coming into the fall, they looked pretty much identical because they only graduated, I think, about 3 players from the spring. There was a few players who I think wanted to play the spring just to play a few more games, and then, you know, they moved on. I know they lost 2 starters, a pair of twins from Billings, Montana, who graduated and wanted to get a master's degree, and they moved on to another school to play football there as well that they couldn't quite do at UM. So the team looks almost identical, and I think that's going to be a huge aspect of this team just because, you know, there's not many changes. They have that game prep under their belt with each other, and they kind of know what to expect. So I think, you know, as far as what those spring games did, I think they got exactly what they wanted out of it. They wanted to get on the field. They wanted to win a couple games. They wanted to, you know, kind of prove to people that, you know, they were going to be a force to look at coming into the fall as far as FCS football goes. And, you know, just kind of get some cohesion because it just been so long, and they had some new players they needed to work in the mix as well. So, yeah, it should be a lot of fun. And then, so for Lauren, for you, my question, you know, kind of returning to the Huskies is, like you mentioned, they're coming in at number 20 in the AP poll. I think they're one of 4 Pac-12 teams, I think, ranked in the AP. So, you know, how do the Huskies kind of feel about that ranking? You know, they're always Washington. It always feels like a force, especially up here in the Northwest. Do they feel that maybe they should have been ranked a little bit higher? Or does that feel about right for this team?
For sure. So yeah, like you mentioned, in the preseason, I think UW was one of the 5 Pac-12 teams ranked in the poll, the 3rd highest. So they had Oregon and USC both ahead of them at 11-15, and then Those teams were also the two picked in the preseason Pac-12 Media Day poll to win the North and the South divisions respectively, and then meet in the Pac-12 championship. And UW was picked to finish second in the North. And then, like you said, obviously in the AP poll, Washington at number 20, and then Utah and Arizona behind them. And I think UCLA also received some votes. So that's kind of where the conference stands in those polls entering the season. For the Huskies, if you kind of look back a little bit, they're actually ranked a little bit higher than the last time they appeared in this poll, which I believe was after they came back to beat Utah in that thriller last November, when they were down 3 touchdowns at halftime, and then they ended up scoring the go-ahead touchdown with less than a minute left and ultimately won that game 24-21. So the following week, I believe they checked in at number 23, and then ended the season in the receiving votes category after losing what ended up being their final game to Stanford. So they've actually jumped up a little bit in this preseason poll from where they finished last year. But I would say, particularly this season, it's kind of difficult to gauge what preseason rankings should be and where everybody should end up in the poll, just given how different the college football season was last year, and how the sample size differed in terms of how many games teams played, et cetera. So where the rankings are hasn't really been something that's been addressed during camp. But what has been talked about by, both players and coaches is kind of what their expectations are for this program year in and year out. Jimmy Lake got a question recently about what a fair expectation is for this program each year, and basically said that, every year the Huskies should be contending for a Pac-12 championship and going to a big bowl game, and nothing less than that. So they want to be in the hunt for that conference title every year, as the season winds down, and then put themselves in position for a big bowl game. And, some of the players have echoed those goals as well when they've spoken during camp. So, I mean, in terms of rankings, assuming you meet those goals by the end of the season, you're probably going to end up a little bit higher than 20. So Kyle, for you, my next question would be, which position group on offense should the Huskies be preparing for the most heading into this game, and who are some of the impact players?
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest strength for Montana, I would say, is probably their receiving core, with offensive line maybe not far behind it, just in terms of experience and talent they have at those positions. Their wide receiving group is probably one of the deeper positions on their team. They recently lost a transfer, Samori Toure, who was an All-American receiver in 2019. He transferred to Nebraska. If he had come back, they could have arguably made a case to have the best wide receiving core in the FCS, in my opinion. But so he's gone, but they still bring a lot back. They're headlined Samuel Akem, number 18. He is kind of he was their breakout star in 2018, the year before Samori did. And then in 2019, Sammy, I think played about 6 or 7 games. Then he unfortunately broke his foot against the University of Idaho in Missoula. So his season was cut a little bit short. So I know he's hungry. He's one of these guys who I think if he has a big year, he's on track to rewrite, I believe, the school records for touchdown catches and receiving yards. And, some people have tabbed him as maybe one of these FCF guys who cracks into the NFL this upcoming season. So he's kind of the main, staple there, just because he's been there for so long. And then on the opposite side, on the outside, is Mitch Roberts. He's from Missoula. He's a guy who had to step in 2019 when Sammy went down with an injury. And he, I don't want to say surprised a lot of people because he's very athletic, but in high school, Mitch was a quarterback. I believe he played a little bit of safety, and then he transferred to transitioned to wide receiver in college. So, he played well at young, and then in 2019, when he saw extended minutes, he really kind of stepped to the next level, and now he's starting opposite Sammy, and he's a very talented player as well. And then in the slot, they have Gabe Solzer, another kid who in 2018 is a true freshman. He kind of broke out in a way. He's from Billings, Montana as well, another Montana player. And then in 2019 also saw his year cut short due to injury. So Sammy and Gabe especially played really well in those 2 spring games. I think they both came out, with even more extended breaks due to those injuries, and they came out ready to play. And as they're a very formidable group, but then they go deeper than that. They have Malik Flowers and Keelan White and Ryan Simpson. Like, it's a pretty deep and talented athletic group. And then, offensive line, as I kind of mentioned a little bit, is just experienced. When Bobby Houck came back in 2018, it wasn't a very experienced group, not very many true offensive linemen. Whereas this year, on their 2 deep, about every single one of those guys can, they're true offensive linemen, and they can also, rotate positions, which, just adds depth. And we'll be interested to see how they're tested by a Pac-12 defense, because, the Huskies are big and they're physical. That's for sure.
For sure. For sure. So tell me about Cam Humphrey. So he's a former, high school standout here in Washington, and he's been named Montana starting quarterback for week 1. I believe he's been there since 2018. Can you kind of tell us about what his path is to winning this starting job, and what you've seen out of him since he's joined the program?
Yeah, he's the biggest storyline from the Grizzlies' perspective for sure coming into this game. Went to Issaquah High School, which I believe, according to Google Maps, is that's my reference here, is 21 miles away from Husky Stadium, which is really cool. And for him, he's just had a really cool journey, and it's kind of a cool moment for him to be starting in this game, because he started his career at Boise State for a year, where he redshirted. Then he goes to Saddleback Community College in California, plays well, and like you mentioned, comes to Montana in 2018 and serves in a backup role for a couple of years. Poised to be the starter in 2020. It's postponed. He's not able to do that. Now he has to wait. Gets to start in the spring, but he's being pushed by this redshirt freshman. His name's Chris Brown. He's from California, but he went to high school in Bozeman, Montana. And Chris has shown a lot of potential and talent at quarterback. But for Cam, coming into fall camp when there was a little bit of a quarterback competition, the biggest thing that Bobby Houck mentioned for him was consistency and experience. And that's just what Cam had. In 2019, he started in 3 games when their previous starter was out with an injury, and Cam played well. Then, like I mentioned, he started both of their spring games. So Cam, just his consistency, his experience, and, just kind of being one of those older players who's seen success, I think helped him a lot. And it is, just a really cool story, because he has had he had to wait an extra year when he was supposed to be the guy. He's already had kind of a long college football road. And so the fact that he, got the okay to be the start of the season, it's going to be right, not far from where he grew up, I think is a pretty special moment. Obviously, he's very focused on this game. He told me he did grow up a Husky fan, but obviously that's not going to be the case this week. So he, I think it'll be interesting to see how he stacks up. And, I think with him, he doesn't really make a lot of mistakes, which I think is, pretty key, especially with this group, because he has the talent around him. I think as long as he doesn't make mistakes, the Grizz could be poised for a big year from his perspective. So overall, just a cool story, and, just kind of neat to see him, get a chance to do something like this, because that's one of the cool things about these games, right? FCS, FBS, you see some of these kids go play where they grew up in these bigger towns and things like that. So overall, pretty cool deal for Cam Humphrey, and, it'll be interesting to see how he plays. And, my next question for you kind of deals with a redshirt freshman as well. Like I said, Chris Brown didn't quite get the job, but Dylan Morris did last year when he was named the starter for Washington, went 3-1 as a starter. So how did he look as a, obviously last year was such a weird year, but how did he look as, being thrown into the fire, and what are kind of his expectations this next year to have kind of more of a normal fall camp and everything like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned growing up as a Husky fan, so Dylan Morris did as well. He talked about this in high school, and then he's talked about this, coming into this season as well, how it was always a dream for him to be a Husky quarterback. And, he's worked up to this, and now he's getting the chance to kind of guide this offense. So Dylan came in to UW's program in the 2019 class. He enrolled early. I believe it was the winter of 2019. So he was there for classes. And then he participated in spring practices as well. So like you said, he redshirted that first year. That's when Jacob Eason, who's another local guy here from Lake Stevens, came into the program, and he was the starter for that season before heading off to the NFL. So Dylan kind of got that year to learn the college football environment, and then obviously won the starting job last fall in a very different season than normal for everyone, and a shorter season, obviously. But even dealing with kind of all of those challenges, he performed well. He had never played in a college football game before he made that first start against Oregon State in November, and he won the first 3 games of his college career. So like you said, they finished 3-1, and he led the Huskies in that big comeback against Utah in November, like I was talking about earlier. They're down 21-0. He had some turnovers in that game, but, he showed resiliency, and then he threw the 2 late touchdown passes that gave the Huskies the win. And so in 4 games, he ends up with 897 passing yards and 4 touchdowns. I mean, his completion percentage was nearly 61%. And then he rushed for a couple touchdowns as well. So when we came into camp, Jimmy Lake was kind of asked about the quarterback situation and when he'd kind of like to solidify that. And he was, up front and said, Dylan Morris is our starter. And he said that on day 1 of camp, and Dylan took all the reps with the first team offense in the first couple weeks of practice that were open to the media. And he looked very poised and very comfortable when they ran through team periods. Very efficient in the open scrimmage they had that we got to see in August in, the last open practice. And I think I unofficially had him at like 17 for 26 for 22 yards and a couple passing touchdowns. And then he rushed for a touchdown too, and no turnovers on his 6 drives that day. So, I mean, he's looked very confident running the offense. He shows leadership ability. And that's kind of what we've seen from Dylan, throughout his high school career throughout his football career going back to high school. He's a local South Sound kid. He started all 4 of his seasons at Graham Kapowsin. They went to the state playoffs every year he was there. Always a contender. It's a big 4A program. And they always have, very competitive teams. And, he was a big reason for why they were so competitive every year, because he was very comfortable and confident, leading that team. So I think it's going to be really exciting to see what he can do with a full season after getting those 4 games of experience last fall. Jimmy Lake has talked a lot about kind of his growth and development during the past month of camp, and basically said, that Dylan's a better football player now, just having had a full off season, a full spring camp, a full fall camp, than he was this year, just given the experience that he has now. And from how his coaches and teammates have talked about him heading into this season, there's a lot of confidence in how he can lead this offense. And I think, the expectation for him this season is that he'll build on what he was able to do in those 4 starts. And then, beyond just what he's able to do, he also has a lot of depth and experience to work with in the other pieces of this offense. UW brings back everyone from their offensive line last year, including Jackson Kirkland, who's their all Pac-12 first team left tackle, and then 3 other linemen who were honorable mention all conference picks last year. And then even beyond the starters on the offensive line, they have several more linemen who have game experience. So there's a lot of continuity there. The Huskies have veteran experience in their backfield too. Richard Newton and Cam Davis are the 2 starting options that are listed on the initial depth chart, but they also have Kamari Pleasant and Sean McGrew, who are both back for their 6th years and have played a lot in the years that they've been with the program. And then Cade Otten was UW's leading receiver last year at tight end, and he's back along with some other guys in that group who return. And then the Huskies don't have as much experience in their wide receiver group, but they've made some big plays during camp. They're hungry. They have a lot of talent. So Dylan certainly has a lot to work with this year.
Definitely. And to piggyback on Cade Otten, the funny thing about Montana coach Bobby Howe, because he doesn't necessarily talk about opposing players a whole lot, but kind of unprovoked brought up Cade Otten's name, obviously, as one of the top tight ends in the country, future pro. For him, I know he's been a starter there since his redshirt freshman year. So what about his skill set has made him so prepared, and how has he developed both as a pass blocker and a receiver to be such a dangerous option for this offense?
Yeah. So Cade's another player that we followed along with since his high school days. He's from Tumwater. His family has a really long football legacy. His grandfather coached high school football in Washington for 49 years, mostly at Tumwater, which is a state contender also every year. And he remains the winningest high school coach in state history here in Washington. And he played college football. Cade's dad's been one of Tumwater's assistant coaches for several years, and he's their defensive coordinator now. He played Division I football. So did Cade's uncle. And then his younger brother, Ryan, who's a senior at Tumwater right now, recently committed to the Huskies as a tight end as well. So there's a lot of family history there. But with Cade, I think it was easy to tell, even when he was still playing high school football, that he could have a lot of success moving forward, just given the work ethic and the impact that he always had on his team. So Tumwater runs the wing T, so it's a very run-based offense. And so he developed as a blocker. I think he's considered a pretty elite blocker now. But he was also really sure-handed when Tumwater did throw the ball, and ended up leaving high school with all their program receiving records as well. He played linebacker, so he was an important piece of the defense. So really, everywhere you looked, there was Cade Otten making play. He was just consistent. He was really reliable in whatever his role was at that moment. I wrote a story recently where I kind of took a look back at his senior season in high school when Tumwater played Bellevue, which is, another program that's had a lot of success in the state. They played early on in the season, and Tumwater's up at Bellevue, and they're behind in the final moments of the game. So they drive down the field and end up with enough time for one play at the 26-yard line. And so the quarterback snaps the ball, and Cade and several other guys run toward the end zone. and the ball gets thrown his way, and there's just kind of Bellevue defenders piled all around him, and he still goes up and grabs the ball, and Tumwater wins the game. You could always count on him to make plays, and I think that's continued at UW. So this is his fifth season, entering his fifth season this year. He redshirted his first year in 2017, but he's been a contributor for their offense ever since. He played every game as a redshirt freshman. He started 10 of them, and then he started every game for UW the past 2 seasons. And then last season, obviously led the Huskies in receiving, 258 yards, 18 catches, 3 touchdowns. And then also he caught the final 2 touchdowns from Dylan Morris in that Utah game. So he shows up in big moments, whether it's the passing game or, blocking in the running game. I think one of the first days of camp this summer, Dylan called him Old Reliable. He's steady. He's looked really good in camp. He's steady as always. So I think he should have another productive season. And then, certainly UW has had a really good run of putting tight ends in the NFL in recent years. And it certainly seems like he could be next. And then for Kyle, for you, let's kind of switch it up and talk about the defense here a little bit. For Montana, who should the Huskies be preparing for on defense, and who are kind of some of their impact players there?
Yeah, and to piggyback on your last point, one of those tight ends is Will Dissly, who's a Bozeman, Montana native, which is he's a nice guy. I've interviewed him a couple times, and fun watching him with the Seahawks. So as far as Grizz defense goes, I think this is probably the strength of their team, is this defensive unit as a whole. They just look really, really good in the spring. They're kind of a cohesive unit, and a lot of returners back from, both 2019, but also bringing all those guys back from the 2 spring games, I think is a big deal. I think, they've looked really good in fall camp, and I think they're going to cause a lot of problems, for any team they play, but especially in the Big Sky this year. I think they're going to rank among the top there for sure. I think their strength is probably their linebacking core for sure. It is probably the most experienced, and it's probably the deepest as well. Their 3 starters are Patrick O'Connell, Jace Lewis, and Marcus Wellnell. All 3 who are from Montana, which is very rare when you see a full position group starting from the state of Montana, even at UM or MSU. So pretty cool deal there, but they're just experienced players. Marcus Wellnell is the newest starter, but he was a backup to Dante Olson in 2019. Dante Olson's a former Grizz great, and got a lot of experience that way. But you look at really they're 2 deep at linebacker, and a lot of those guys I think are going to see big minutes with this team. I think they're going to rotate them in a lot. Same with the defensive line. They'll see a lot of guys rotated in a lot, but linebacker especially is just a very deep group. Their defensive backs have improved from 2019. It was a unit that probably had a few struggles back in 2019 that, they were a good unit, but you could see their struggles, but they brought most of those guys back, and they've all improved. And, you can kind of see that now. And then defensive line, they brought in some FBS transfers. Joe Babros, they brought in from NC State a few years ago. And then recently they brought in Justin Belknap, who played at the University of Arizona for 4 years. So they brought them in. They run kind of a 3-man front with 3 linebackers, and then usually about 5 defensive backs, kind of a 3 safety, 2 corner. That's kind of their base defense. And that's kind of what they'll do there. And, defensively, I think it's one of their strengths. And I'm excited to see how they match up against an FBS program like Washington, just to see how they're able to kind of weather that storm and deal with a team that's going to be, faster and bigger than what they're used to. But overall, they'll be a good group. And I think that's going to be a real strength to this Grizz team, really kind of as a whole. So, and I know, Washington, obviously, when I was growing up, they put defensive players in the NFL left and right. It feels like every single year. So I imagine this year is no different. When you look at this defensive group, who kind of stands out, and which of these guys probably has, a future playing on Sundays here, maybe after the season or somewhere down the road?
Yeah, so UW had 8 players on the preseason All Pac-12 team, between first team, second team honorable mention, including several of their defensive guys. Obviously, that's been a strength for them, in recent years. So Trent McDuffie, who's one of their starting cornerbacks, he was first team preseason All Pac-12, started every game for UW. Last season, finished with 14 tackles, had an interception and a forced fumble in the 4 games, and he's been locked in all camp, seemingly with Kyler Gordon. Who also got an all-purpose and special teams nod on the preseason all-conference team on the other side. So those 2 have been pretty locked in at the cornerback positions throughout camp. And then inside linebacker, Edufwan Ulafashio, he's another preseason guy who got a preseason all-conference nod. He led the Huskies in tackles last season. He had 47, had a sack, 2 fumble recoveries, forced fumble. And Jimmy Lake, and other coaches and, teammates have really high praise for him. He's, one of the first guys in the building every day and, watches a ton of film and kind of has earned everything, that's come his way through kind of his work ethic and hard work. And he's definitely, one of the leaders of this defense and this team. And then, they've got experienced guys elsewhere too. Ryan Bowman has been there. He's entering his 6th year. He plays outside linebacker. He has a ton of experience. They have experienced starters on their defensive line, several guys in the mix at safety. So yeah, they've got, experience and depth in a lot of spots. And then, I should also mention last season's, All-American, all Pac-12 first team linebacker Zion Tupu Alefatui. He could be back this season. Jimmy Lake said first day of camp, he expects to see, ZTF back this season. Obviously an Achilles injury in the spring. But Jimmy Lake said his rehab's ahead of schedule, didn't give a specific timeline on when he might play. We didn't see him, practice in the practices that were open to the media, but, said that opponents kind of should be ready to see him. So the Huskies do expect to have him back at some point this season as well. And then kind of my last question for you, Kyle, who are some, we like to talk about the local guys. So who are kind of some of the other Washington natives on this Montana roster, who could be impact players for the Grizz this season? I know there's a few local guys from here over there.
Oh yeah. There's always a great pipeline from Washington to the Grizz for sure. And just kind of the last look for my research here is I believe there's 5 Washington natives listed on the 2 deep as starters. We talked about Cam Humphrey at quarterback, but some of the other guys, you have Gavin Robertson and Nash Fouch, both I believe from the Seattle area. I think Gavin's from Auburn and Nash is from Woodinville, I believe. And then Corbin Walker at cornerback, he's from Renton, Washington. And then Cole Grossman is the lone starter or the second starter on offense, along with Cam Humphrey. Cole Grossman will be their starting tight end, redshirt freshman. Tight end's probably their most inexperienced group, but Cole Grossman's looked really good, and the coaches have kind of talked him up a lot during fall camp. So those are the 5 for sure that will get a lot of playing time, and you'll see a lot. But you'll see other guys like Michael Matthews at linebacker, Jacob McGurran at defensive end, Skylar Martin offensive line. I believe there's 10 Washington natives on Montana's roster, 10 or 11. So they're always impactful. And yeah, there's that group of guys, especially on the defensive side. Those guys are, experienced, been around for a while, and they are, I think going to be a big part of this season. So, and then, my final kind of question here as well is just, you mentioned a little bit about Jimmy Lake through some of these questions. Obviously last year was his first year. It was, the pandemic year, and they still went 3-1 and obviously had, some growing pains, but, had some success too. So how has he acclimated to this program since Chris Peterson, left the program?
Yeah, I mean, I think it seems like it's been a pretty seamless transition. Practice runs well, and I think it'll be exciting to see kind of what, like with Dylan Morris, what he can do in a full season, what Jimmy Lake can do in a full season leading this team, just, given how short and, different everything, was in last season with the pandemic. So I think everyone's really excited to see what a full season, with him leading this team is going to look like. So I think it'll be exciting to watch. And we will get to see it begin tomorrow on Montlake. The Huskies and Montana kick off at 5 p.m. That's all we have today. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this live Q&A. Kyle, thanks for joining me. Safe travels over here to Seattle. If you would like to continue to follow along with Montana season, find Kyle on Twitter at khansen406, and you can read his work at montanasports.com or stream at KPAX-TV. For more Huskies news, you can find me on Twitter at SmithLM12 or read TNT online or in print. Head to thenewstribune.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining, everyone.